Well, Democrats around the country will be coming together in a new way next week for their party's presidential convention. The gathering will look very different this year, of course, because of concerns over the spread of the coronavirus. Instead of a large celebration with thousands packed into an arena with colorful signs and balloons, they will hold a smaller virtual gathering with the party's presumptive nominee accepting the nomination virtually from his home in the state of Delaware. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign is weighing how the president will accept his party's nomination the following week. So for more on this, we want to bring in Larry Sabato. He is the director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia and a politics professor as well. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right.
Thank you, thank you.
You know, these conventions are usually big, splashy events. They've gotten bigger and bigger, and there's always many speakers, and sometimes you get a little indication of who the future rising stars of the party are based on, you know, their performance. Can you just give us a wee bit of a history lesson, Larry, about the significance of these conventions? It's a little more than just a big party.
Sure. They pretty much extend over the entire history of our popular voting, which didn't really begin until 1824. Conventions, at least at the state level, had already begun by the late 1820s. And by the 1830s, we had national conventions. And as you said, they had become bigger and bigger and bigger, but they've also lost a lot of their meaning because in the beginning and for many, many decades afterwards, they really were deliberative bodies that determined who the presidential nominee was and who the vice presidential nominee was, and the party platform of whatever origin. So things have changed a great deal, but they're still important moments, or at least they have been up until the virtual convention, for parties to explain what they are and who their nominees are.
You know, typically a party may see a bit of a bump in the polls after a convention, but, you know, this is a virtual convention. It's going to be a lot different. And also we're increasingly sort of questioning what polls really do mean, particularly after the 2016 election. Perhaps it's just a moment in time. Perhaps it's just, you know, a moment for good fundraising and then it kind of goes back down. But, you know, what sort of impact do you think these virtual conventions will have on the parties and whether or not that impact will even mean anything?
Well, we haven't seen them, so you never know what tricks they have planned. But I'd have to say that it's probably going to have less impact, both of the conventions, than normally is true. How do you get a bounce out of a virtual convention where I guess there's an hour mainly reserved on the major networks in the evening for the convention? And of course, today people have dozens and dozens of other choices on television and movie channels and the rest. We're not going to have large audiences. It's not going to be at all spontaneous. Granted, the speeches were never spontaneous, but at least other things were. You had the audience there, and sometimes supporters of the loser in the primary campaign would be rather rude to the ones who won. Well, that's news, and it gives you a measure of whether a party is united or divided. That's gone. That's gone. So I don't think we're going to have the usual bounces, maybe 2 or 3 points, but not 8 or 9 or 10, which we've had on occasion. Often the bounces cancel each other out from the two-party conventions. So we're adapting to a new system. We'll see whether it's permanent. That partly depends on where this pandemic goes and how long it lasts. But for this particular cycle, we are running a presidential election in a very, very different way, including the non-convention conventions.
You have written about this election in the Democrats that President Trump is a unifier for Democrats. And I know that, or there's been much talk anyways, that, you know, that Joe Biden's team has been working really hard to pull in those more progressive members of the party, the people, the Bernie Sanders people, the Elizabeth Warren supporters, people who during the last election were very vocal in their disappointment that Hillary Clinton had become the nominee. So that's all fine and dandy, and I get the logic in that. But should Joe Biden win, and there's no Donald Trump anymore, what's your take on whether or not the Democratic Party will remain unified?
Well, look, a humorist said back in the 1920s, I belong to no organized political party. I'm a Democrat. Nothing's changed. They are very faction oriented. So are the Republicans. The Republicans have become factionalized, except I think they've lost a fair number of moderate Republicans. But in any event, the Democrats have some reasonably well-defined factions. And of course, they will express themselves the day after the election. They'll start fighting over cabinet positions and other appointments and the first actions of the new administration. So, we might as well get ready, because if Biden wins, if the Biden-Harris ticket wins, then that's part of it. But you know what? I would bet anybody that the defection rate this year will be much lower than it was in 2016 for Democrats. They lost a lot of Bernie Sanders people. They didn't vote for Trump so much. A few of them did. But they voted for the Green candidate, or they didn't vote, or they wrote somebody in. Look, part of it was nobody, including many of the Trump people, thought Trump was actually going to win. So they thought they had the luxury of doing that. Well, we all found out differently. They didn't have the luxury of doing that. They now know that. They've seen 4 years of Trump's governing. And as I mentioned, Trump is often accused of being a divider, but he's also a uniter. He's a uniter of Democrats. And that's going to make a difference at the polls.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask you about something else that may or may not make a difference at the polls. The congressional races that are coming up. We've just gone through a bunch of primaries. Some of the more progressive members of the party that were primaried were successful. They won. Ilhan Omar has retained her seat. And then some, on the Republican side, certainly some interesting people will be on the ballot leading up to November. I want to ask you whether or not you think the congressional races will have an impact on the presidential election.
Well, I know what you're talking about. We're talking about some rather extreme candidates, to say the least.
Yeah.
And, they're associated with this QAnon group and other things. But notice they're from mainly deeply red districts, deeply Republican districts. Anybody on the Republican label is probably going to win those districts. Maybe one or two exceptions that go too far, people reject them. But on the whole, I don't think they're going to have a big effect on the presidential election, because this is an election that is all about Donald Trump. No cut to Joe Biden, no cut to the new vice presidential candidate, Senator Harris. But this is an election mainly about Donald Trump, a referendum. Thumbs up, thumbs down. And by the way, the thumbs are pumping both up and down. It's not as though adrenaline is not a part of this equation.
You had sort of mentioned, I mentioned it, but you sort of clarified this. I'm thinking of one particular candidate with this connection to QAnon. And we here at CBSN have talked a lot about QAnon and its influence or lack of influence over politics. I mean, how do you sort of factor in QAnon or these sort of more extreme conspiracy conversations that happen on the internet? Do you think that's like a whole separate conversation and really not what's happening in real politics?
Yes. In a word, yes. Look, America, if you look at the history of America broadly, it's all about conspiracy theories. I mean, we are very good as a society at conspiracy theories, concocting them, passing them along, having passionate supporters of them run for office. But in the long run, I don't think it matters that much. And this year in particular, it doesn't matter that much because, as I suggested, it's all about Donald Trump.
Okay, now I'm going to pivot back, right, to sort of the down ballots. In terms of senators, in terms of the House races, how do you see either of them leaning?
Well, amazingly, the Senate races are really on the edge of the fence. It's easy to imagine if Joe Biden wins by a decent margin that there will, in fact, be a Democratic Senate. Maybe it's just 50-50 with the tie broken by the new vice president. Or maybe it's an outright majority, 51 or 52 seats. Could it still move back to the Republicans? Sure, they're in the favorites position theoretically because they have 53 seats now. They have to lose net either 3 or 4 seats, depending on who loses the White House. But a year ago, I don't think most people thought that would be all that competitive, that the Republicans might lose a seat, but they'd stay in charge of the Senate. That is an assumption that no longer applies. As for the House, now, surprises happen, but I don't know anybody on either side of the aisle who privately will tell you that the Republicans have any chance of taking over the House of Representatives. Publicly, naturally, the people who are running the Republican campaigns will say, in order to excite their base, yeah, we can do it. We're almost there. But nobody really believes it. And probably Democrats have a better chance of adding some seats than losing some seats.
Larry Sabato, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Really insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.